Good morning, dear friends. My name is Igor Yakovenko. It is now 7 hours 42 minutes in Kiev. Today, February 25th. And we continue our daily morning reflection on what is happening in Russia, in the world, in Ukraine, and in our souls. Well, it is now the fifth long year of the war. A very large and full scale model. The total war waged against Ukraine. A very telling event, or rather, two distinct and contrasting events took place yesterday in both Ukraine and Russia, highlighting the vastly different paths of their leaders. President Zelensky addressed the people of Ukraine with a direct message, while Vladimir Putin, exactly as I had expected, did not utter the words fourth year of the war at all. Instead of addressing the nation, he chose to speak exclusively at the FSB board meeting, focusing on internal security matters rather than speaking to the citizens directly. I won't to carefully interpret, retell in detail, or provide a commentary on the various public speeches and addresses of the President of Ukraine or Putin. Might be quite a fascinating intellectual exercise, but it seems to me the anatomy, these kinds of anthropological differences between, in general, the fundamental internal anatomy of how both Ukraine and Russia are structured is vividly and completely reflected in this singular fact. We are witnessing 4 years of a terrible, monstrous, brutal, and devastating war occurring right in the very heart of the European continent. Russia against Ukraine. And on this day, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky himself, he does the most natural and organic thing possible. He directly addresses all the people of Ukraine. On this particular day, Vladimir Putin chooses to do something that seems absolutely unnatural and out of character. Instead of taking the time to address the ordinary citizens whom he should rightfully consider his own people, he decides instead to hold a high-level meeting with the influential board of the FSB security services. Those are his people. In other words, my dear compatriots, my fellow citizens, and all people of Russia, please understand that Putin does not truly consider you to be his own people. Instead, he only considers the members of the FSB to be his people. That is precisely why he chooses to meet with the FSB board on this very anniversary, the fourth anniversary of the Great War. Believe me, that is the absolute truth. Everything else he says is a lie. This is, a sort of investigative probing, a brief and fleeting glimpse into the depths of what is called Russia. So, Putin considers the FSB his own loyal people, while Zelensky considers Ukrainians, the citizens of Ukraine, his people. That's the difference. And this difference is actually deeply fundamental and essential. It is a profound anthropological divide that separates the two, a vast and systemic gap in values, and a clear and undeniable distinction between the democratic spirit of Ukraine and the oppressive Russian fascist Reich. As a matter of fact, for the next several days, we will have a sort of marathon. It will be a comprehensive review of 4 years of war and an attempt to look into the future. Several dozen leading experts from both Russia and Ukraine will take part in this live marathon of all different shapes and kinds, because, this reflection is very important right now, I believe. Well, as we all remember, they originally planned to take Kiev in just 3 days, but this war has now been going on for 5 long years, and I would really like to draw your attention to, in my opinion, a rather important investigation recently conducted by the BBC journalists together with Mediazona, specifically the journalists working at Mediazona. It was documented that the names of more than 200 deceased Russian soldiers were established. Moreover, the hypothesis is that this is what has been established for certain. More than 200,000 Russian soldiers have been lost on the battlefield. These are verified and specific data points established by name. At the same time, it is generally and widely assumed, and this is already a very significant assumption, that for every single confirmed death, there are likely 7 unconfirmed ones. Well, if you take that number and multiply 200,000 by 7, actually, this is precisely what Russia has already paid for. Roughly 8,000 square kilometers of occupied territory. What is 8,000 square kilometers? It's an incredibly tiny and remote settlement. Just a very quiet, small settlement. It's a settlement where life moves at a much slower pace. Very few people live. And this is the price that has been paid for it. So, it turns out to be 16 people per square kilometer. What I mean is, that is a monstrous, staggering, absolutely monstrous price. I would like to say just a few more words about this particular study, because I think it's very important. This is the detailed and comprehensive breakdown of the staggering and heavy price that Russia has paid for Putin's monstrous, terrible, and utterly criminal military adventure. So, to begin our analysis of this situation, so what exactly are the final conclusions here? Well, a total of 57% of all those people killed are bought cannon fodder. That is, ordinary civilian people who had absolutely no connection to the army at the very start of the war. Casualties on the front lines are continuing to mount at an alarming rate. It appears that the year 2025 is becoming the single bloodiest year of the entire war so far. So, if you take into account what the independent researchers from the BBC and Mediazona consider to be the most likely outlook by the end of their investigation, that total figure represents more than 90,000 people confirmed killed in action. So, the BBC and Mediazona journalists conduct their investigations using many indicators. So, what is the basis? First of all, it's obituaries. And in 2025, there was a notable 40% increase in published obituaries when compared to the data from 2024. And apparently, 2025 is the bloodiest year for the Russian army. The second major conclusion is the reality is that 40% of all those who were killed are people who had signed a contract. That is, in fact, this is bought cannon fodder. There is also a very significant conclusion regarding the possibility of upcoming mobilization, as many people currently believe. The findings of these researchers show that no, mobilization is not necessarily inevitable because Putin can maintain the necessary influx of volunteers into the army. So, in other words, there is a formal statement by Alexander Kalyandra, who is a senior research employee at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Let me find it. I have it written down somewhere so I can quote it accurately. So, it is widely assumed and expected that the number of people who will consider the possibility of signing a contract and going to war will continue to steadily increase as the Russian economy slows down and wage growth rates decline. This is a completely logical and plausible scenario. If we proceed from the fact that the Russian economy is not going through its best times, and I think both experts and observers alike, supporters of an extremely dire situation, such as Professor Lipsitz, as well as those who believe that things are not so bad with the Russian economy. People like Oleg Sashenko, for example, or Nekrasov. But everyone agrees that there are problems. And that essentially means that as the broader Russian economy continues to shrink and deteriorate further, the total number of desperate people who are willing to make their money, not through traditional economic sectors, but rather through the machinery of war, will certainly not decrease, but will instead continue to steadily increase over time. That's a perfectly logical conclusion. So I think, of course, accurately predicting and forecasting exactly what kind of unpredictable madness will strike us and in which particular pot it will happen is a very difficult task. Will strike Putin's head. That is not a particularly rewarding task. Nevertheless, the objective indicators and the objective circumstances clearly demonstrate that Putin still has resources to manage his operations without mobilization. The third very important conclusion, but it was already known. Nevertheless, when the data clearly demonstrates that this is exactly what is happening, the evidence is there. That's very important. It's that the main losses, these burdens often fall on smaller, disadvantaged settlements and rural communities. Mostly, those who sign these contracts are residents of small towns and villages where there is a shortage of stable jobs. Beyond that, the rest of the situation remains quite clear. That is to say, it comes down to poverty and a lack of future prospects. Death in war, these elements are deeply interconnected. The correlation between poverty and death in war is exceptionally intimate. This correlation is remarkably significant. That is to say, moreover, furthermore, it is also worth noting that there is a clear and measurable correlation between the total number of Russian soldiers killed in the ongoing war and the level and life expectancy of the settlements. There is a direct correlation as well. So, to put it simply, those individuals who go to war are often the ones who feel they have absolutely nothing left to lose. When looking at the absolute numbers, Tatarstan and Bashkortostan are currently in the lead, but that's strictly in absolute terms. These are some of the most significantly large regions of Russia. But in terms of losses per capita, among the male population, Tuva and Buryatia lead by a staggeringly large and significant margin. These are precisely the two regions where both poverty and low life expectancy are prevalent. Another very important conclusion is that the connection between how much an individual can access and use public resources, which essentially refers to their social connections and professional networks, opportunities to participate in public life, and things like that. To put it another way, people who are integrated in some significant or meaningful way deeply into Russian society have a much lower chance of dying in the war. Why is that? So, first of all, in the first year, for example, a significant share of those killed were the mobilized individuals from the parts of Luhansk and Donetsk regions of Ukraine occupied by Russia. These are people who were less integrated into Russian society. Well, in other words, no one feels sorry for them. That's what it is. Second-class people. By the way, a lot is being written about this right now. Traitors of Ukraine. That is, those specific individuals who actively campaigned for the arrival of the Russian world, residents of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions who betrayed Ukraine. Now they're writing a great deal about how the Russian world has completely abandoned and forsaken them. There is no water, there is no food, we are being killed, and so on. This is that part. Second-class people who have been turned into, the Russian world has turned them into the so-called liberated residents of Donetsk, Donbas. The second category, which dies more often than others, is people who have been recruited for the war from among the convicts. Well, convicts who went to war, they constitute a remarkably substantial percentage of the disposable and discarded cannon fodder. Well, simply because, you see, 67% of them are from rural communities, small towns, and a significant portion are convicts. That is, people who, so to speak, do not possess any kind of media resources, any financial resources, and other similar assets, and are not properly assimilated into the fabric of Russian society. In other words, the Kremlin's policy from the very beginning. The strategy was designed so that the most affluent and resourceful segment of the Russian population, those individuals who possess significant financial resources, influential media resources, and high level status resources, would not even notice the war. That is to say, this constant and repetitive refrain, which I often quote, is a persistent refrain from Ksenia Sobchak that on the warm rooftops of Moscow are being held. Atmospheric concerts are precisely a project to make sure people don't notice, to make it seem like everything is fine. Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major cities with populations over 1 million have. Residents of these localities are hundreds of times less likely to die in the war. And then finally, another conclusion is it is quite evident that there is a significantly higher percentage of officer and general fatalities in this conflict compared to almost any other modern wars. I won't present a massive amount of statistics here, but it's very important to emphasize that this specific detail really stands out. The armed forces of Ukraine, especially when considering the unique specifics of this particular war, and please excuse the tautology, are dealing with this highly effective and targeted work carried out by drones. In fact, they actually account for roughly 90% of the overall elimination of enemy personnel on the battlefield, and they specifically target high ranking officers, and that is exactly why more than a large number of their leaders are constantly at risk. 7,000 officers, Russian officers, have been killed, who have been killed over. These are confirmed, I want to emphasize again, confirmed by obituaries. This number statistically significantly exceeds the proportion of officers killed in similar wars. And I'm not even talking about the staggeringly high and disproportionate number of Russian generals killed in action. This fact is even more striking when you consider the details. This is not so much the work of drones, this is even more so, this is the work of Ukrainian special services. That is what is real. The total number of those who have been killed could very well be several times higher than reported. In other words, this number could easily be 500,000 or perhaps even 1 million people. This clearly shows that, in fact, when combined with all the other devastating consequences of 4 long years of war, we can truly talk about the real national suicide of Russia. That is to say, Russia, with the direct help of Vladimir Putin, has simply, let's say, committed a form of collective national suicide. This is exactly what it is, and there is no other way to describe it. It is my firm belief that this diagnosis will be validated and substantiated with every month and year that passes. The continuation of the war more and more, and in the end, it will result in the real suicide of Russian statehood. I am increasingly convinced that this is exactly the outcome of this war that awaits us. What are the prospects? Well, this is the 5th year of the war. We see a growing and noticeable trend moving toward what can be called the Kadyrovization of Russia. That is to say, what has been occurring and unfolding in Kadyrov's Chechnya is, to a very large extent, now being implemented and integrated across the whole of Russia. And there is yet another significant and influential beacon for Russia, which is called North Korea. Right here, a highly relevant and recent investigative report comes to mind quite appropriately, which originally came from several different sources, the well-known publication Newsweek, and also, as well as other outlets, according to reports recently published in various South Korean media outlets. This specifically refers to information that Kim Jong-un, after the Ninth Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea. It should be noted that the Congress took place and Kim Jong-un was once again elected General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea. He has held this position for 15 years already. Most likely, he will hold it for as long as he lives. And here is the information that he, Kim Jong un, appointed his 13-year-old daughter as the head of the missile administration. She consistently accompanies him at a wide range of high profile military events, specifically during critical missile tests and strategic defense drills. In light of these frequent public appearances, both Newsweek and several major South Korean news publications are now confidently suggesting that he is currently preparing her to become his official successor to the national leadership. That is to say, that she, this young one right here, a mere 12-year-old girl, is already giving out direct orders, and the high ranking generals are currently conducting specialized training just for her. And now, the National Intelligence Service of South Korea is already officially calling this young girl, whose name is Kim Ju-ae, the most likely heir to the seat of power in the country. Furthermore, the fact that Vladimir Putin is also gradually and very quietly bringing his own children out of the shadows and into the public eye is an undeniable reality. In general, this movement toward a North Korean style of governance is becoming more or less obvious to everyone watching. And there is one more very important piece of news that I think is definitely worth mentioning in our broadcast here today. This latest news today is from the Crime and Punishment series. There is new information coming in from this ongoing war. It has been confirmed that the former deputy head of the anti-corruption department within the Ministry of Internal Affairs for the Northwestern Federal District has been eliminated during the recent conflict. Police Colonel Mikhail Smirnov. He was successfully taken out as a direct result of a targeted suicide drone strike. And this happened, I believe, roughly about a week ago. To be completely honest with you, I haven't had the time to check the exact details right now. The source, but it was about a week ago. Why do I think this is so important? It is because this particular colonel was a typical self-serving ghoul, a notoriously corrupt and deeply dishonest official. He was responsible for the murder of a prominent journalist from Fontanka named Maxim Maximov, an incident which tragically took place back in 2004. He killed him for the purpose of conducting thorough anti-corruption investigations. Maxim Maximov was a prominent member of the St. Petersburg Agency for Journalistic Investigations, a reputable and fairly well-known agency that specializes in, well, a very serious agency headed by. He was a highly respected and well-known media organizer based in the city of St. Petersburg. This was Mr. Konstantinov, and then there was this man, Maxim Maximov, who was deeply engaged in various anti-corruption investigations, including detailed investigations into many corrupt activities. Of this very Colonel Smirnov personally met with him and sternly warned him to immediately stop what he was doing, but he refused to listen, and Smirnov ultimately killed him. He was also accused of murdering several other people over a period of time, which meant the authorities had turned his case into a series, and he was ultimately convicted. Well, the facts were simply proven by the evidence presented. He was convicted, and then he went, so to speak, to serve on a specialized contract, entering into a formal military contract. As a result, well, as they say, his new military career did not last very long at all. He was killed in action not long after. Why do I believe this particular fact deserves to be brought to your attention today? It is because war is, without any shadow of a doubt, a monstrous and truly horrific crime. However, as an unintended result of this ongoing conflict, there is still the eventual elimination of some of the most repugnant and despicable individuals currently found among the Russian population. I wouldn't say that's a very good thing. Of course, there are still quite a few ghouls left who are currently undergoing their retraining courses while the war is still ongoing. Crime and punishment. To put it another way, I cannot simply say that this is entirely good news, but it is certainly the kind of news that brings with it a very specific and certain sense of quiet satisfaction. My dear friends, we had previously made a solemn commitment with all of you where we talked in detail about the tragic and recent death in prison of the talented artist Alexander Zatsenko, who had been wrongfully convicted for the fact that he was actively distributing various poems written by Ukrainian poets. On this basis, he was officially declared a dangerous terrorist, just like his wife. He tragically passed away while held in the penal colony. And we agreed with you that we must also support his wife, the artist Anastasia Diudiaeva, who is currently held in the same colony. She was also convicted of terrorism for the exact same thing. That is, she distributed various poems by Ukrainian poets together with her husband, and for these poems, she was declared a terrorist like her husband, but she is alive. We all came to a mutual agreement that there was a meaningful initiative to find a way to support her in this endeavor. Consequently, we decided that we would publish a set of detailed instructions directly on the screen to show you exactly how to do this. I would like to ask you now to please turn your attention to the screen to see the specific steps involved. To write letters, because this is really very important. In the colony, a person feels isolated, and letters provide a lot of support. There was a time when I personally visited a great number of colonies and many prisons several times, and I know that I spoke with prisoners, and I know that for them, what seems trivial to us is very important to them. And now you see what needs to be done in order to write a letter to Anastasia Genadievna. Here is her address. You can copy all these details from the screen and send a letter. I think this is absolutely crucial. This is the very least we can do to support this truly remarkable and wonderful woman.